I'm about 30 seconds from this cough drop being done. I was so close to timing it just right. I want to quickly add one thing to the announcements before we get started. Y'all are generous as always. We're good on the monetary now. So as far as the breakfast goes, we have the money that we need. So now it's pretty much just, I know several have already signed up to just show up and help. That's really the main thing that we need right now. So thank you all so much again. We always are thankful to see the engagement and the excitement about doing these kind of things for the kiddos. So we've been looking, as we've gone through the last several Sunday nights, at different evidences for God and His creation, kind of diving into more detail about some of the scientific aspects. We're going to look at one more of those tonight, and then we're going to kind of transition to something else starting next Sunday night? Yeah, next Sunday night. But tonight, I want us to look at another one of these elements. I guess that TV isn't on, Ray. If you wouldn't mind, turn that TV on. We're going to look at this idea of fossils and fossil forensics. Now, if you're like Liz and love watching those crime dramas, then you probably know forensics is basically when you're trying to kind of go to a crime scene or something like that and trying to piece together what happened. Well, that's kind of what we do when we look at things like fossils. Part of what we're doing there is we're kind of trying to figure out what exactly happened in the past. Like what caused this? This helps us kind of know about maybe events that have happened in the past, about creatures that have existed in the past and maybe no longer. A classic example, right, would be dinosaurs. We don't really have dinosaurs running around, although the last Jurassic World movie kind of tried to get that started, at least our imaginations. But there are creatures and things like that that no longer exist, but we can learn about them from the fossil record. We're going to look at that this evening and try and kind of piece together some things that hopefully will help us to maybe engage in conversations when people bring things like that up. So let's start with just a really simple question. What is a fossil? Anybody know? How would we define a fossil?
Skeletal remains that have been dried up in rocks and so forth.
Okay. A couple of things you said are very much something that I want to build on. You mentioned skeletal remains, if you couldn't hear what Ralph said. Oftentimes, it is what do you want to call it? The more solid parts of a creature or of a person, sometimes even, those are usually the things that are fossilized. Meaning, for example, if I were somehow to be fossilized, or my body was, probably my flesh, my skin, those kind of things, they're probably not going to survive. But my bones and things like that, that's usually what can last longer and sometimes be fossilized. You also mentioned rock. Typically speaking, when we're talking about fossils, and this is something we may not often realize, if you see those fossils, again, we'll use dinosaurs as an example. When you see those fossils of dinosaur bones, you might be interested to realize that's not actually the bone. It is a bone that has been replaced by stone. Usually, when we're talking about fossilization, we're usually talking about a process that we call petrification. Essentially, the idea that you have something that's living, that's organic tissue, organic matter, and it is replaced over time by minerals, by stone, essentially. For example, if you've ever been to a petrified forest or if you've seen petrified wood, well, it's no longer wood anymore. It is rock that has replaced the wood, but it has replaced the exact shape and size and so forth of the wood. That's what usually is happening. Now, there are other kinds of fossils. You can have, for example, imprints, like footprints and things like that. Those are also technically considered fossils, but of course, there's not actually a foot in there or something like that. It is the imprint of a foot. So it's a little bit different. There's not really a replacing going on, so there's not actually anything there. It's just the print itself. But if we're talking about an actual, a fossil, as in this is actually seems to be part of the animal, what it really is essentially the animal has been encased in sediment or something like that, and then over time, how do we put this? The organic material has just kind of gone away, leaving that hole, which is then replaced by the minerals. So, long story short, that's essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about fossilization, at least for our purposes tonight. Now, as we're talking about that, there should be an obvious question that comes to mind. How many of y'all have ever seen roadkill as you're driving down the road, right? See it all the time. In fact, I don't know that I've ever driven anywhere unless I'm like in downtown Dallas or something like that, and even then, right? I don't know that I've ever driven anywhere without passing at least one dead something on the side of the road. Well, most things don't turn into fossils because they rot. So how can something turn into a fossil instead of just rotting away? Why do we have fossils at all? Why didn't it all just rot away?
They have to be covered very quickly.
Okay. Most of the time, and anyone, we're talking, people who believe in creationism, people who believe in evolution, it doesn't matter. Anyone will agree who knows about this topic that the vast majority of dead things do not fossilize. They just rot. 99.999 whatever percent of animals, past, present, and future, they're never going to become fossils. They never became fossils, however we want to use the tenses, right? That's usually not what happens. It usually just rots away, just like the roadkill on the side of the road. However, as Ralph said, sometimes there is a specific process that takes place that is unusual. Essentially, if you're going to have something that is exposed to the air, it is going to decompose. I think in a lesson a while back, we talked a little bit about the idea of spontaneous generation. Before, men like Louis Pasteur and others, people thought that if you just leave, a bowl of soup out in the wind, eventually there will just be life spontaneously generating. In other words, just popping into existence. And of course now we know, well, actually there's little bitty creatures that, float on dust particles, and they fall into the soup and multiply and so forth. So it's not that it's spontaneously generating, it's just so small that we can't see it with the naked eye. Well, similarly, if you leave something alive out in the elements, it's going to attract all these different decomposing type of bacteria and sometimes even larger things like buzzards and stuff like that. And so usually it's going to decompose unless it can be buried, and buried very quickly. Now, typically speaking, we bury humans, right? If someone passes away, we do bury them, but typically speaking in nature, outside of that process, we're not really in the business of just burying things that happen to die. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand like if a pet dies or something like that, sometimes we'll bury it, but I just mean like we don't go around making sure everything's buried. And even if we do, we usually don't do it in such a way that it will, stop the decomposing process. So even then, we're talking about something very different here. Ultimately, we're talking about a process that almost always has to do with water. Essentially, and again, this is on both sides of the aisle, whether people believe in creation or evolution, you almost always, pretty much everyone agrees, have to have something buried through the process of water washing like sand and sediment over something very quickly. And that is what ultimately preserves it, stops the decomposition long enough that you might have a fossil form. The currents, if you've ever watched like on the beach or something like that, when the sand comes back and forth, it's actually really fascinating. I didn't ever grow up around like the beach or the ocean or anything like that. I think when Liz and I went to Florida to get married on the beach, when did I say that was? My third time going to the ocean or something in my entire life, right? So I've hardly ever been to the ocean. And you could tell I was just giddy to be out in the ocean. But when you stand there, and this is something, again, kind of was new to me, but when you stand there, it is amazing how much sand moves back and forth with the current, with the tide. You would think just from kind of looking at it from a distance, the sand's there and the water just washes up on the back, washes up on the back. No, there is tons of sand moving constantly with the waves and the currents and the tides and all this kind of stuff. So if you have an animal, let's say, that dies and it lands in water somehow or it drowns or whatever the case might be, it can get buried pretty quickly because of how much currents and things like that move these sediments around. It can bury it. That usually is the process that we're talking about. So basically, something dies, somehow it ends up in water, the sediment is kind of washed over it, or it buries it in the sediment, and then it is preserved enough that it begins to slow the decomposition to where this fossilization process can occur. Now, you might already see some of where this is going, but let's consider a couple of interesting facts as we're talking about this. You may not be aware, because most of the popular fossils, as we've talked about, are like dinosaurs and things like that. But actually, 95% of the fossils that we have, probably more than that even, but that's at least the low number, are of sea creatures, like shellfish and things like that. Also, shark teeth are a very commonly fossilized thing. Well, why? Well, because they're already in the water, right? And if the water is crucial to the process of fossilizing something, well, it makes sense that most things that are fossilized are things that already live in the water. Now, it's interesting, and we'll talk more about this in a second, but I'm not aware of any mountain that you can go and hike up where they have not found some sort of fossilized or semi-fossilized shellfish-type creatures, which is fascinating because that means that there are ocean-going creatures that somehow were on top of a mountain and got underwater. We'll come back to that in a second. Yes?
Go back one.
Yeah.
When I was a freshman in college, we went on a day trip to look at fossils.
Mm-hmm.
And this was, I don't know, south of Oklahoma City, might have been around Purcell or south of Purcell. I think those were ammonite fossils, weren't they?
Yes.
They get pretty big, or different sizes, but
Yes.
in Oklahoma, there they are.
Yes. And think about that. In Oklahoma, right? There's not oceanfront property in Oklahoma. That's not how that works. So how did that get there? Again, we'll come back to that in a second. So we already mentioned, if we have all these sea creatures that are fossilized, well, how would land animals get fossilized? Granted, I guess every once in a while, maybe you could have a zebra who accidentally stumbles onto the beach and then drowns or something, I don't know. But typically speaking, again, both sides of the aisle, most people agree that either this has to be a creature that lives next to a river or a lake or an ocean, meaning a land creature, and somehow their body ends up in the body of water, or maybe this is like flooding or something like that. But that's usually the explanation that's given for this kind of event. I have a couple of quotes up here obviously from an evolutionist point of view, but nothing particularly wrong with it. Land animals may die and be swept out to sea to be buried in the same way. It's discussing the process of fossilization, basically saying they die and then, high tide comes in and it washes the body out to sea and then it gets buried and fossilized and so forth. We also have this guy, he's what is he, the resident geologist at one of these state parks or something like that where they have a lot of fossils. He says some died, talking about these fossilized animals, some died shortly before the area flooded and covered their remains in mud and silt. Others were washed into a river by heavy rain. Now, that's interesting. Now, we want to be fair to those who believe in evolution. We've talked a little bit about uniformitarianism versus catastrophism, those big words that you were hoping never to have to hear again, right? But just a refresher, catastrophism, we're talking about things out of the ordinary happening that are usually more responsible for, things that are big changes that we see. That's one theory. The other theory is that everything just kind of continues without big catastrophes being involved. To be fair to uniformitarianisms, people who believe things are kind of uniform, it's not like they don't believe that local floods happen, or it's not like they don't believe that tornadoes or volcanic explosions or whatever. They believe those happen, and that's part of their process. So something like an area flooded and things got buried in mud and stuff like that, that's fully acceptable to someone who believes in uniformitarianism. But we keep going. It takes a long time to make a fossil. This is from a magazine called Science Daily. It takes a long time to make a fossil. The fossilized dinosaur bones you see in museums spent tens of millions of years buried deep underground, transformed by heat, pressure, and chemical reactions. But scientists have discovered a new way to simulate key fossilization processes in a lab in about 24 hours. Now, I want you to notice a couple things about this statement. Number one, they have to start off by saying, usually fossilization takes millions of years. But the entire article is about the fact that scientists have figured out how to do this in 24 hours. If you keep on reading through, and he mentions it in this quote even, if you keep on reading through, the main things that they say aren't usually present, but you can accelerate the process, the main things are heat and pressure. You need it to get hot, and you need to have a lot of pressure, a lot of, usually some kind of weight kind of bearing down on the remains to get this to happen. They've done the same thing, by the way, with stuff like coal. They've actually created like lab-grown coal, if you will, in like 24, 48 hours by using this kind of heat and compression type process. So we think about that. Is it possible that all the fossils that we have access to at this point, that we've discovered, maybe I should say, is it possible that all of those are individually the results of like localized flooding, localized, catastrophes, animals dying next to rivers and oceans and stuff like that? Is it possible? Sure, right? I mean, it happens. We certainly know that happens. But the narrative has always been, for those who believe in evolution, that the typical process, even if it initially is caused by some kind of, local flood or something like that, that the process still has to take those millions of years for this kind of thing to occur. I love the way he phrases it, whoever wrote this article in Science Daily, I love the way he phrases it, a new way to simulate key fossilization processes. He's got to word it that way so that it doesn't sound like they literally made fossils. But the only difference between, when you really read the article closely, really the only difference between the fossils they create in that lab and real fossils are the fact that one didn't happen naturally, the other happened naturally. This isn't really different, but they have to kind of present it as two different things so that, their narrative stays there. He's got to say it takes a long time to make fossils usually, but, now we can also do it in 24 hours. Now, once again, we think about these two things, heat and pressure. Those are two key ingredients that are often missing in just, average situations. Usually you do have to have some kind of, long period of time. If you don't have enough heat and pressure, it's going to take a lot longer, in other words, for fossilization to occur. That's fine. Okay, whatever. I still think that you're going to run into a problem of decomposition if you talk about millions of years, because even though the decomposition is slowed, well, you're still going to have it happening. And so you really need it to happen faster than that. But heat, high heat, and pressure. I want us to think about something. Let's start with the pressure. Anyone ever gone like diving in the ocean? Like, not necessarily scuba diving, but even like snorkeling, something like that? Or if you haven't, I never have. If you haven't, have you watched someone do that, watched a video or something like that? I remember reading a book a long time ago. It was like a book written for like young adults or whatever. It was a story. And in the story, it was like a team of scuba divers. And they were always really careful not to go down into the ocean or come up out of the ocean too fast. Anybody know why that is? What about it? Okay, the pressure is stronger the further down you go. Number one, that means if you go too far down, it's going to be too much for your body to handle. And number two, when you come back up, because the pressure changes so dramatically, you actually end up, if you come up too quickly, you get air bubbles in your bloodstream and you die. So you really don't want to go too fast in this process. You got to have a very gradual process to get your body acclimated back. But think about that much pressure. I mean, we're talking, I can't remember what it was. I think it was like, you're going to get me lying now if I try and give you the exact number, but it doesn't take very long at all to get to like 14 atmospheres worth of pressure when you go underwater. Meaning 14 times the pressure that we experience just here at sea level, right? So we have a lot of pressure if you go underwater, especially if you go to any depth. Now, something else that's interesting to think about. If you were to take an Earth that is mostly flat, meaning it doesn't have all the mountains and valleys that we have now, you would have a very significant depth of water. If you put all the water in the world and just made it entirely flat, sometimes people say, oh no, there would only be like 2 feet or something like that. No, that's if you have the current topography, meaning this kind of, the up and down, the mountains, the valleys. If you actually kind of flatten things out more, you have several, if I remember correctly, several hundred feet of water that you're dealing with, which means a lot of pressure. But heat, is it hot or cold when you dive down into the depths of the ocean? It's usually cold, right? I mean, after all, the sun doesn't reach very far, contrary to popular belief maybe. You don't have to go very far for the sun to be almost absent in terms of sunlight in the ocean. So it's cold. Well, doesn't that mean that we have a problem then? Because you have pressure, if you're talking about an ocean or a flood, you have pressure, but you don't have heat. Well, let's think about something. When we think about the flood as described in Scripture, certainly we have pressure described because of the water and the massive water and how it was moving and all these kind of things. You have more than enough pressure to rapidly create fossils, kind of like the scientists did in 24 hours. But what about the heat? Part of the problem when we think about a flood is we kind of isolate floods to what we remember or what we've seen in kind of a localized setting. Typically speaking, if something floods, there's not a lot of heat involved, kind of like if you dive into the ocean, right? But the description in Genesis is interesting. We're told that the fountains of the deep broke and water gushed out from the deep. Now, we don't really understand all of what that means, but we do see something very interesting in our planet, and that is that what we call the Earth's crust, meaning the outer layer of the planet, it is fractured. That's why we have things like earthquakes and mountain ranges, because these, what we call tectonic plates, they are in pieces, and they kind of move around and create these earthquakes when they kind of grind up against each other, create mountains whenever they kind of go up or go down like this. But why is it fractured in that way? Well, if the fountains of the deep are broken, that could very well be a shattering of the Earth's crust. But what do you think happens when you shatter the crust of the Earth? What else would come out? Even in modern day research, you can find underwater volcanoes. Look that up sometime if you've never seen that. It's kind of incredible. You literally see magma coming up out of the ocean floor. That, I think, is going to be a little hotter in that situation. But of course, that's rare right now, meaning at this point in our planet's history. But if you have a worldwide catastrophic event where the crust of the Earth is breaking, you think that's going to release a lot of things like magma and, I guess we call it lava. There's technically a difference. I don't remember what the difference is. I think there's your heat. The point I'm trying to make here, it's not that we look at evolutionists and we say, there's no way fossils could, take a while to form. Now, I don't think it would work with millions of years, but even if you say, a few hundred or a few thousand years, okay, whatever, that could probably happen for fossilization to take that long. I don't have a problem with that. But it's just as likely that you would have a whole lot of fossils created in a very short amount of time, just like we've done in labs, if you have the heat of all this magma displacement and tectonic motion combined with the pressure of water being condensed in this way. It sure makes a lot of sense. The point being, just from a purely scientific perspective, it makes just as much sense to go with the Bible's account of things than to go with the common knowledge of current scientists in that regard. Now, of course, there's a whole lot of other more minute details we could talk about, all these kind of things. Most of that's way above my pay grade. But all I'm trying to get us to see is that when people say, oh, that's not possible, look at all the fossils we have, that proves the age of the earth. We ourselves can make fossils now. And there is a very legitimate description of an event that could have done the exact same thing. The waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered, Genesis tells us. Now, once again, before you have the crust of the earth broken up, well, you're not going to have mountains as high as we have now. That would be formed by that breaking up. So at that point, the high mountains aren't that high, which means the entire earth can be covered with the amount of water that we have. That's also one of the criticisms people try and make of the flood. Oh, there's not enough water on earth for it to cover the whole earth. Well, yeah, if there's mountains and valleys to the depth and the height that we see, but I would argue that was caused by the flood, and you don't have that initially. Yes, it's possible for fossils to form over a long time, but other explanations are just as plausible. This is where we have to be willing to just say, now hold on a second. I understand you are suggesting here's how things happened. But if there are two plausible explanations for something, you can't just pick your favorite and say, well, this is how it happened. You got to at least start with, well, wait, there's two possibilities. Which one is actually more likely? I want to wrap up with an interesting experiment that was done in a lab, a different experiment. I want to say this was called the Miller experiment. They basically tried to recreate the atmosphere that they assume was the atmosphere of the early Earth, evolutionists, I'm saying. The atmosphere that would have created that, first life in some primordial soup somewhere. They tried to create that. They managed to kind of form some amino acids or something like that, which there's a whole long description of why that doesn't mean anything meaningful, at least for that particular experiment. But the idea was, look, we've done it in a lab, that proves it can be done. Well, that experiment really didn't prove much of anything. And yet here we have an example of fossils and coal and all these other things that are supposedly millions of year processes, and we have done those in a lab. And yet somehow it's absurd to assume that such a rapid process could have been the case in nature as well, given certain circumstances like a worldwide flood. This is always a case of, I understand that you want to be rational, but so do I. So let's talk rationally. Because what people are told is the only possible way really isn't when it comes to things like this. Like I say, I hope this has been helpful for us looking at some of these different concepts related to apologetics. Starting, I think, like I said, next Sunday night, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to try and dive in a little deeper to some of the characters mentioned in Hebrews. Because I want us to spend a little more time on some of the characters that we talked about in Hebrews chapter 11 in particular. We didn't really have time to, for example, ask, why in the world is a man like Jephthah in the Hall of Fame of Faith? Well, I don't want us to miss that, but I also didn't want us to get bogged down for like 10 weeks in Hebrews class itself. So we're going to spend some time looking at some of those. Any last comments or questions, though, before we close on fossils? Well, as always, the Lord's invitation is open. If there is anything we can do to help you, to encourage you, We serve an amazing God who created an amazing church. It allows us to be here for one another. So if there is something we can do, please let us know as we stand and sing.
When Jesus comes to reward his servants, whether it be noon or night.